So, what is the purpose of this implementation strategy? In August 2019, the National Information Technology Development Agency issued the National Cloud Computing Policy. And the purpose of this policy is to provide policy statements that articulates, government strategic and plan and direction in helping government organizations and SMEs that provide digitally enabled services with the adoption of cloud as in computing. And to ensure that this is done effectively, the National Information Technology Development Agency also issued out an implementation strategy so as to ensure that the goals of the National Cloud Computing Policy is effectively achieved. Additionally, before I go further, the goals of the cloud computing policy is to help organizations, increase their adoption of cloud computing, by 30%. Additionally, it's also to help increase the investment in cloud computing by 35%, in the country by 2024. So to ensure that these goals are achieved effectively, we now have the implementation strategy to help ensure that all these goals, are properly achieved. Next slide. Next slide. So like I mentioned earlier, we are going to go through the structure of the implementation strategy. There are 5 chapters there, okay, and after the 5 chapters, you have, the appendix, which provides further information to help you implement the implementation strategy. Within the implementation strategy, you have 14 strategies. So under each strategy, you have one or more strategic initiatives. So what a strategic initiative does is to provide you with the entities that will help with the implementation of the strategies and also, activities involved. So, without wasting too much time, the first chapter is introduction. Okay, and the introduction just, talks about the function of the strategy as a plan. And as I mentioned earlier, the cloud computing as a policy was issued by NIDA, to ensure that we can increase the adoption of cloud computing in Nigeria. Also, I've talked about the purpose of the cloud computing strategy. Then also, I've talked about the strategic initiative to implement the policy of the statement. Then also, within what we have there, we'll have a strategy as a framework to ensure that all that has been mentioned earlier, is encapsulated. Then finally, on that introduction, you have the cloud first proposition. Because one of the objectives of the cloud computing policy is to encourage the adoption of cloud computing first.
Sorry, I'm suggesting let me just add the system to that place.
Okay. So the whole purpose is to encourage government organizations, private organizations to consider cloud computing first in the implementation of their information system, unless otherwise there are concerns about security of information, or things, within that nature. For example, I don't expect data that concerns national security, to be kept on the cloud. Rather, it's better, such information is kept on a standalone server, totally off the network. Likewise, one doesn't expect that a company's trade secret, should be kept on a cloud computing system. So if those are not concerned, then the advice, the recommendation of the federal government, represented by NIDA, is to ensure that entities consider clouds first, for their implementation, for their information systems implementation. Then chapter 2, which constitutes majority of the strategy, is where you have the strategies for implementing cloud computing policy statements. So like I mentioned before, if you look at the strategy, there are about 14 strategies there. Under each of the strategy, you have strategic initiatives with entities that will collaborate to ensure that each strategy is effectively implemented. So what we'll do, we'll try as much as possible, because 15 minutes is a limited time, to go through all this. So I'll just try as much as possible, to go through that. So strategy 1, development of cloud procurement regulation. As we all know, when it comes to the procurement model, within the country, or according to the procurement law, government organizations are expected to budget on a yearly basis. issue out as in contracts on a yearly basis. So this model is different, from the cloud computing payment as a model, which, as we all know, is on a pay-as-you-go as in basis. So to ensure that this payment model is recognized by the as in government, it is very important that the NIDA collaborates with the likes of Bureau of Public Procurement and other stakeholders to ensure that a procurement regulation that recognizes this, okay, is as a made, and at the same time, to ensure that government organizations that want to go into cloud computing with a pay as you go as a model, do so without contravening procurement as a law. Then number two, establishment of digital marketplace. So the intention of this strategy is to ensure that NIDA and other relevant stakeholders create a portal where all sorts of information that will allow entities that want to adopt cloud computing can go to and have such information. So definitely NIDA is going to be collaborating, especially with the private sector, to ensure that this portal is created for entities or willing adopters to have enough information. Strategy 3, development of a cloud data classification guide. So this is really very important. This guide will ensure that potential adopters have what it takes to classify their data in order to make a decision whether to adopt cloud computing or not. There are different categories of classification. We have documents that are within the sensitive as in class. We also have data that constitutes national security. We have data that are just meant for organizational operations. So this will help such an entity make a decision whether to still go ahead with the adoption of cloud computing depending on the class the data belongs. Then strategy 4, development of a balanced data localization and cross-border data flow guidelines. In simple words, what this will do is to help ensure that cloud service providers that want to operate in Nigeria must comply with laws regarding data localization, which means that data, especially data for government, is expected to be kept within the country. And if situation warrants for such data to cross-border to other countries, then such cloud service providers will be expected to comply with extant as in laws. For example, if you check the Nigerian Data Protection Regulation, there's a requirement that shows you the process you go through in case data will be stored outside the shores of the country. Then number 5, develop an SLA template for cloud engagement. This is also very straightforward. As we know, when it comes to any service at all, especially digital technology related service, it's always very important that the customer and the service provider agree on a level of as in service. This is very, very important before continuing with the service. So this will ensure that a template is created for potential adopters to be guided on how to engage in an SLA with a cloud service provider. And where there are shortfall in service, there should be a section within that SLA that will also provide some sort of compensation for the user. Then number 6, stakeholders collaboration for protection of consumer rights. Yes, this is also very important. We know cloud computing is a service, and it's very important, very instructive to ensure that we maintain high quality user experience. So for this strategy now, NIDA will be expected to collaborate with the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission and other relevant stakeholders to monitor and also ensure that they enforce the consumer protection section in the National Cloud Computing Policy. So this is very important. So before we get confused, we are talking about two different things as in here: the National Cloud Computing Policy and the strategy as in documented. So number 7, development of a National Cloud Computing Security Guidelines. This is very important for us to achieve the goals and objective of even having a cloud computing ecosystem within the country. We all know that security, if not well addressed, can effectively derail us from achieving the objectives. So this guideline will ensure that the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data and applications on cloud systems are properly preserved. Then development of a Nigerian cloud interoperability guidelines. So this is also very, very, very important because when it comes to cloud computing, there are situations where the user or the customer may want to, say for example, port from one provider to the other seamlessly. And for that to be possible, there is a need for interoperability, amongst, cloud service providers within the country. So there are different regulations that I believe that, this can benefit us in from. Then number 9, development of a cloud migration guide for public institutions and SMEs. This is also very, very, very important. So this guide will ensure that potential adopters of cloud computing have the necessary guideline to help them as they migrate into the cloud. For example, if you're trying to migrate to the cloud, especially if it's your information systems, it is expected that you think about things like virtualization or creating VM as machines. It's also expected that you worry about security as in concerns. It's also expected that you look at the costs involved and also the skills involved. So this particular strategy will help provide all the requirements for that. Then number 10, facilitate the development of special skills for cloud computing in public sector and among targeted SMEs. So for this strategy, NIDA once again is going to collaborate, especially with the private sector. They are training outfits to ensure that some sort of framework is developed, and also digital literacy and skills are provided for potential users in government organizations and also private organizations. Then also facilitate the development of, develop vendor lock-in avoidance guide. This is very, very, very imperative. We don't want a situation where cloud service providers in Nigeria will be running on proprietary devices, proprietary infrastructure. So as in with this, cloud service providers that are running in Nigeria will adopt the data portability principle that ensures that any data kept by any user on their network can easily be taken out and migrated to another cloud service provider. Then number 12, registration of indigenous CSPs. So with this strategy, NIDA will put in processes, of course, in collaboration with relevant stakeholders, put in processes to ensure that cloud service providers are properly registered. There will be requirements, for cloud service providers to operate in Nigeria, will have to, comply with. And of course, before we can start registering cloud service providers, there will be a certification criteria. That is really, in fact, we have developed that already, but this gathering will also provide an opportunity for us to look at, what we have done in terms of the criteria for registering, cloud service providers. Then number 14, establish cloud system audit and reporting process. This is really also very, very important because it's one thing to have a cloud ecosystem. It's another thing to have an effective cloud ecosystem. So for us to ensure that the cloud ecosystem is as effective, as possible, then there must be a process, for auditing, just like what we have with the Nigerian data protection regulation, where you have data controllers being audited, at intermittent, by DPCOs. That is talking about the Data Protection Compliance Organization. So this also will be applied to this, to the cloud computing as in policy, just to ensure that cloud service providers, operate in accordance with the requirements of, as in the law. Next page. So, let's move to chapter 3, which talks about the Nigerian cloud computing governance. So here, what you have, is to provide some sort of governance structure, to ensure efficient and effective coordination of cloud implementation, and as in procurement. So definitely, the governance structure will ensure, proper planning, architecture development, and the management and maintenance, of the cloud ecosystem. So for this, there will be 2 levels. We'll have the national governance structure, headed by the presidency, and we also have the organization, data governance structure, to ensure that, things run properly according to, requirements when deploying your cloud system. Then quickly, implementation plan, which is the fourth chapter, talks about the plan for implementing the strategy itself. So you have the short, the medium, and the long term as in plans. So within that plan, you have a table that shows on one column the strategic initiatives, action by entities, and the timeline. And we hope that this can be implemented between 2019 and 2024, at least as at the time this strategy document was created. I pray that that doesn't change the new course of deliberation on this implementation strategy. Then the final chapter talks about compliance and enforcement framework. And this is to ensure that anything that has to do with compliance, enforcement, within the cloud ecosystem, are properly spelled out. For example, registration of cloud service providers, just like I discussed earlier, then the monitoring, auditing of cloud service providers, federal public institutions, and SMEs, just like I discussed earlier. And also, very importantly, it will also detail, processes for administrative sanction for those cloud service providers and other entities that, breach or defy the national cloud computing policy. So beyond this, like I mentioned earlier, what you just have is the appendix page that details other information that can help with the effective implementation of the strategy and also the strategy initiatives. Next page, please. So the next page just shows this. I don't know whether we can see this very well, but if you can't see very well, then I'll just take my time to go through it. So this is a national cloud computing governance structure. Recall that I mentioned that we'll have two folds of the structure, one at the national level and one at the organizational level, that's expected to be implemented by the organization. So for the national level, we have the presidency at the top. Then under we have the Federal Ministry of Communication and Digital Economy. Then also on the same level, we have budget and national planning. Then under we have the FCCPC, NIDA, then DPP. Then at the base level, we have both the users and also the cloud service as a provider. So I'm just showing this, just to show you, the structure, of the planned governance structure. Because as far as we are concerned, the governance structure is one of the most imperative, important elements in ensuring that we effectively implement, the cloud computing policy. So I believe that, with this few words of mine, we will have some sort of background that can help us, provide quality input and, improve the quality of this strategic document. Thank you very much.